Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me. This is Jason Bosch, and this is if we were honest. If we were honest, I'm real excited about today's show. Once again, Facebook streaming is always difficult. I'm going to keep trying during this, but I don't think Facebook streaming is going to happen. So I'm going to post a link onto Facebook for the YouTube. It's on the YouTube channel though. So, but today I want to welcome. I've got a guest by the name of John Titus, and I discovered John's YouTube channel a while back ago. He was. It wasn't that long ago, but he was talking about the coin shortage, and that was the video that helped me discover him. But I've been many of you who know me know that one of my big issues has been the monetary system, and so my background is I show documentaries on human rights, environmental issues, and all sorts of different issues. And I realize that there's something wrong here. We're continuing to go backward in spite of all the effort. I mean, look at all the money that's spent on nonprofits and NGOs, and all the effort that people put into donating their time, and yet we're not getting any further. And I've realized that a lot of these problems are actually economic in nature. And what is the engine that drives the entire economic system? Well, it's the banks. It's the money system. Literally nothing happens without first there being money for it. And we think of money as being, something of nature. It's a representation of the exchanges, of the market exchanges that we're doing for one another. And I started studying it, and I realized that that's actually not the case. That money is a fiction. It's as Aristotle pointed out, it's actually a creation of law, not by nature, and that they can create as much of it as or little of it as they want. And so why is it that our entire society is contorting itself to serve the interests of these banks and these money creators at incredible devastation around us? And so I got a little frustrated within my community because all the people that are activists that are concerned about the environment, they're concerned about poverty, about war, but they won't study the money system. I'm like, I come to realize like you literally cannot solve this problem. And I just realized, there we go. Sorry about that. I was looking at the wrong, I was like, oh, I have the wrong camera up there. And I can get rid of this too. See, we're, we're, we're not, oh, we're not ashamed to be somewhat amateurish here because we're human, right? But I realize like all these problems that people are concerned about, they literally cannot solve them without us changing the monetary system. There's no way around it. And so, you know, I've been studying it. There's only a handful of people that are even looking at this thing. And so I was really grateful to find John's site, and it's his YouTube channel is called Best Evidence. And let's see if I think I have that up here. Oh, I haven't. I'll bring it up here in a minute. But I want to just bring John on. Hey, John, how you doing today?
I'm good, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining me. So, you've got a background in engineering, correct?
Right. That's how I started. I picked careers, and the powers that be decided that career's no longer worthy, and I have to go to another one.
And
So,
litigation is another. That's another interest. That's an interesting
yeah, career number
combination.
two was lawyer. Once I realized that the factories are all going to go get shipped away, I was like, well, I'll be the best paper pusher I can be. I went to law school. I became a patent litigator. We litigated patents on behalf of inventors and on behalf of companies.
Mm.
That was number two, but that one's been destroyed. Now I've learned how to make videos, but I make pennies doing this. But I have more fun, and I'm free.
It's always a balance because I have friends who have made really good money, but they don't have any time to enjoy it. And then there's me. I have like a lot more time on my hands, but I'm broke all the time. So
Yeah,
it's a trade-off. Like ideally it would be nice to have some sort of like middle ground where you have a little bit of resources and you also have time on your hands to do the things that you're passionate about. But so you had from talking to you yesterday, you were telling me that you had kind of a certain idea about how the world worked, and
yeah.
that was kind of shattered at some point.
I was just asleep for a very long time and believed everything I read in the textbooks, and everything I saw on TV, basically. And I had been very much geared toward, make money. That's an important thing to do in your life. Make as much money as you can. That's what you want to do. And that's what I did. And then in 2008, really in 2007, I started to notice some cracks in the system, and the things that I was seeing on TV were in direct conflict with what I was seeing on the ground. And in particular, the best example was I had a really good friend who was a stand-up comic, and he was on the road all the time. I would very rarely see him. And in 2007, he's hanging around our neighborhood in Chicago all the time. And the guy's name is John Fox, the late John Fox. He died in 2012. And I said, Fox, what is going on? Why are you? I mean, I'm glad you're around, but why? What's going on? And he said, comedy clubs are closing, and the ones that are still open, the 4-day gigs are now 2 days, and Wednesday and Thursday are now karaoke. And I said, why is that happening? And he said, no one has any money. And I'm like, wow, that's not what I'm seeing on TV. TV, the stock market party's still going. And at that point, I start to watch. I mean, I had always watched the financial markets, but now I began to watch them very skeptically. And I knew by reading and digging in, the banks were up to no good. And a lot of times they were perpetrating criminal frauds, particularly in the mortgage-backed security space. And then 2008 rolls around. I figured, okay, the crisis is hitting, and the debate becomes, do we bail out these banks? And I, believing the meritocracy version of the U.S., publicly, I'm telling all my friends, there's no way these bailouts happen. There's no way they go through. That's not how this country works. It's a survival of the fittest. These banks are going to get crushed, and new banks will grow up in their place. And some, people who have more experience than I, and who saw the world more for what it was than what they wanted it to be, said they're going to get bailed out. You better get used to it. And when banks did get bailed out, I was displeased and had a meltdown, which basically went on for years. And it got worse as the bad behavior of the banks came out more and more. And then they were ginning up evidence to, to basically pursue foreclosures and steal people's houses on a mass scale. I get even more upset. So anyway, that's kind of the how I got to this place where I'm making videos about how the banks operate. I suppose there's one other thing I should mention is there was a PBS program in early 2013 called The Untouchables by Martin Smith, and it talked about why the Department of Justice is not prosecuting banks. And the short answer there is the reason the DOJ, the Department of Justice, was not prosecuting criminal enterprises was that the DOJ was not investigating them. And that is a very, very serious thing, because if you are an entity, a commercial entity or otherwise, and you have criminal immunity, which is what those banks have, you're basically the sovereign power in the country. The president of the United States does not have criminal immunity. He might have it temporarily in office. That issue has never been litigated, but the banks have it. They have it in real time, and they have it forever. And that's what came out of that Untouchables program on PBS on Frontline. And that's when I really started to focus my efforts to make videos. And I really decided, you know what, I'm gonna start making videos with my own hands. By that time, I had already produced a documentary, but I had hired a crew to make the documentary. It was called Bailout. I wrote it, and I co-wrote it with my comedian buddy John Fox. But I didn't know how to turn on a camera, so I hired people to do technical stuff. It was very expensive. Financially, it was a disaster for me, but it whet my appetite, and it set the course where once you draw that line in the sand, there's really no turning back for a lot of different reasons. And so that was really if there was a point where you could say you've crossed the point of no return, that documentary Bailout was it. And that came out at the end of 2012. So that's sort of the long and short of how I went from regular middle class guy to we need to change the system, because there is something so fundamentally wrong and borderline evil about it that we just can't go on like this.
Yeah, actually, someone on YouTube is actually asking how they can get their hands on a copy of that film,
You
Bailout.
can't. You can't. I entered into a sort of not a bad deal, but anyway, for a while it was available on Amazon. It no longer is, which is good. Eventually, I'm going to sell it off just right off my YouTube channel because I've got a lot of cardboard boxes full of full of DVDs. But I just haven't gotten around to it yet. They're not in my possession right now. I'm not in
Okay.
any rush to anyway. It's not. When I look back and I look at that film, um, it's with very mixed emotions that I see it.
Mm.
In one sense, I'm proud that I took that step and I fell on my face. That was something that I needed to do. But on the other hand, it's not the kind of film that I would stand behind right now.
Yeah, yeah. I cringe at looking at some of my old videos that I've made, and I'm
Yeah,
sure I'll cringe at the stuff I'm making now. So it's a process. We're constantly learning. But I guess that's the way you go through it. So on the monetary system, I kind of wanted to. I know a lot of the people that are watching the show. I know there's a few people that are watching it that understand about the monetary system. But do you want to give me kind of a quick primer for someone who doesn't really know what doesn't understand how the monetary system works or why it's important? Like, why should I pay my attention to what the Federal Reserve is up to or what the
yeah,
Bank of International Settlements is doing? How does that affect my life? So, do you want to give kind of a quick, like maybe an elevator, like kind of pitch to like, this is what it is and this is why it matters.
sure. Okay, so let's go back to the Untouchables in that episode where I discovered well the banks have criminal immunity. Once I settled down and have I kind of cooled down over that, I started asking myself, well, is that a cause or is that an effect? I mean, the banks just didn't get criminal immunity overnight. They must have had some predicate power, before they got immunity that gave them this leg up and this gives them this tremendous advantage. And I looked and I researched, and it comes down to the banks, for the most part, issue our money supply. And that issuing money is a sovereign function. It's right in the Constitution. It's in Article 1, congressional powers. It's really, Congress and the Treasury should be issuing money. And every state, like the quote you used at the beginning, Aristotle said, money exists by law, not by nature. And that's right. And so money is really, it's a legal institution, first and foremost. And so if you look in the US, there are three entities that issue money. One is the U.S. Treasury, and that's the proper one, but it only issues coins. Um, the other issuer, the second biggest issuer, is the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve. People think of it as a monolithic entity. It's really 12 regional banks, and they're all private. The biggest one of which is the New York Fed, and the regional Federal Reserve banks are private. They issue two forms of money. They issue Federal Reserve notes, which is cash, and they issue what's called reserves, which is digital, but they don't issue either one um, without strings attached. There's debt attached to that. In other words, the U.S. as an entity, the U.S. government has to borrow, let's say $1 billion and present the $1 billion bond, the IOU, to the Federal Reserve in exchange for, say, $1 billion in Federal Reserve notes. So even though you look at a Federal Reserve, you look at a $20 bill and say, well, there's no debt attached to that. Well, there is. It's just you're not seeing it because the note itself is the liability side of the debt, whereas the bond that you don't see, that's the asset side of the debt. But then that's the Federal Reserve is the second issuer of money in the U.S. The third and largest, far and away the largest issuer of money in the U.S. is commercial banks, and they issue bank money. So you've got money in the bank, I've got money in the bank. All of that money is digital, and all of it is sourced in loans. And you might say, well, I didn't borrow my money in the bank. I've got $1,000 in the bank. I didn't borrow that money. And that may be true, but it's sourced, it originated from a loan somewhere along the line. And the problem with that system, where you have 99.99% of your money, basically everything but coins, is debt. Our money system is debt based. Um, the problem with that is that the banks can call in those loans and they have the power to shrink the money supply at will. And there's periods of history, U.S. history, where the banks do exactly that. They shrink the money supply, they tighten up on it. It caused the Great Depression of 1929, caused the Great Depression of 1920, caused the Panic of 1907. You can trace them all back, and that's exactly what happened. Is the money supply shrinks. In 1929, the money supply shrank by 30% to 1933, and that's what a depression is. No one has any money, and that's why you don't want to leave money creation in the hands of your private banks, because they're going to use that to their advantage. And it's like I say, it's a sovereign power. The power of creating money properly belongs to we the people, not to private banks. But such is our system, and it's given the banks the power to basically, if you look at 2008 and the bailouts, how did that happen? It's the banks have the power to issue money, and they can just put a gun to their head and say, "Go ahead, don't bail us out. See what happens." Because if you look at the four largest banks at that time, it's J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. Those four banks held something like 40% of the money supply. Well, the Great Depression, as I just told you, was a contraction of 30%. So just with four banks, you had the ability to contract the money supply to a greater degree than you did in the 1929 Depression. And that took 9,000 banks failing to contract the money supply. And that's why the banks, that's really what makes them the sovereign power. So if you look through history, you'll see an argument, not really an argument, but a seesaw of which power is greater, which sovereign power is greater. Do you want guns or do you want money? The Machiavelli took the point of view that it was really not, there weren't guns. The word he used was steel. You want steel and army. You don't, because they can take the money. But later thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, and a lot of other people afterwards said, it's the banks have a lot more power. They have more power than standing armies, and that's why, because they can yank you around like Dodo the dog with the flick of a switch, or the flick of a pen back then. But they have tremendous power, and it doesn't belong in their hands. It belongs in the hands of the people, and until we get that back, we're in a bad way.
Yeah. And it's also like it's kind of a dry topic when you start studying money and banking. I mean, even like the videos you put, which you've got a lot of great information, but it also takes like a little bit of patience to like, okay, I need to like, okay, the figuring out how the ledgers work and everything like that. But what would you say to people like that why they should care about this, like how it affects their life?
Well, because if you think about the debt-based monetary system, let's just take $1,000 loan. I'll just use a small example and sort of build out from that. You go to a bank and you get a loan for $1,000. So the way that works is the bank, it doesn't go to a vault and get that money. It just enters a $1,000 computer entry basically in a spreadsheet and just types $1,000. That's it, and deposits that in your account. You can now draw on that, and that's the liability side of the bank. The asset side of that loan is you signed a note, in all likelihood, a promissory note to pay that money back, to pay the $1,000 back, and to pay it back with interest. And I'm going to use an unrealistic example a little bit and just say it's 10% interest so it's easy to compute. And so at the end of the year, you owe $1,100. Now, from the outset, that where the $1,000 of principal is, because you had that. You had that in your account at one time. You know that the principal exists somewhere. It may be in someone else's hands, but the principal is out there somewhere. The problem is the $100 of interest does not exist. And so you have one of two choices at the end of the year. You can either get the principal from somebody else, get the $100 interest from somebody else, and to saw into their principal and create an even bigger problem for them, or you can re-up that loan. Meaning you can sign another loan agreement, maybe for $1,100 or whatever. And so this process continues. And so there's always a shortage of money. And so you set up a system of musical chairs. And the problem with this system is that it creates artificial shortages, it creates artificial scarcity, and it creates artificial competition that doesn't need to be there because we basically don't have enough money because there isn't enough money to pay for everything. We as a society can't consume, just to give you one example, we can't consume 100% of our own output. And so as a result of that, you now have to have advertising to position products because if you just leave things as they are and banks are raking out the interest, there's going to be a lot of products that don't get off the shelves. And so right away you have advertising and right away you have waste just off the bat. And so you have this system of you need more and more and more and more. And so you need bigger and bigger and bigger debts. And so you tend to have these enterprises that are very good at generating large piles of debt. For example, war is a great way to generate huge piles of debt. And if you look back through history, what you will find is that almost immediately upon the creation of a central bank, you will find wars. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and the U.S. is almost immediately. I mean, it just takes a few short years, is into World War One, and so the consequence of having a debt-based monetary system, the consequences are they're almost unfathomable in their reach. They're everywhere, and I think it helps to understand that a lot of times things that it looks like a political issue, it really isn't left versus right. The real fundamental issue is always it's we the people versus the money creators.
Yeah, and it's like there's a quote. I think it was Henry David Thoreau said, there are thousands slashing at the branches for every one, targeting the root. And that really is what's happening is we're dealing with all these problems that are actually downstream from a design. It's a design issue, problem with the,
Right.
and I would say deliberate, but let's just say they had good intentions, which, whatever. It's a bad system. I can, if somebody studies it and says you literally cannot solve these problems within this framework, and it demands infinite growth. It creates things like planned obsolescence, which is a completely insane thing. The idea that you're going to have a system where you take up
Right.
resources. I mean, I use cables. I can't even tell you how many like. Oh, I got to buy a new proprietary
Right.
cable. It's all to serve capital. It's not serving humanity, and so we're serving this legal fiction at great cost.
Right. And that's a fundamental issue is that you're working for money instead of money working for you. And it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So since you started your journey, like, have you, your friends and family, are they kind of coming along with you? Or, I know with me, I was showing documentaries on all these issues, and pretty much every show, at the end of the show, I would end up start talking about the monetary system, and everyone's eyes would gloss over, and they'd be like, "Okay, we're out of here." But I'm like, "No, you come back. You have to understand that this is where everything comes out of." But how about you? Have you had a lot of success? I mean, you're really great because you really just bring a lot of just hard facts, and it's hard to argue with, what you're saying there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you. I work hard and one of the important things to me in doing videos is storytelling. You got to tell a good story. And that's something that I work on. I'm okay at it. I try to get better at it. But as far as making inroads with family and friends, I got to be honest, no, because the, the hardest thing about understanding the money system, it's really not learning it. It's unlearning decades of misinformation that have been salted into your brain. And so the hardest thing is to get people on board with the notion that the money comes from debt because everybody has this idea. You go to the bank to get $1,000 loan,
Hmm.
and the bank just reaches behind it, goes into a vault, and pulls out, $1,000 worth of gold coins or $1,000 whatever. Like that's not how it works. There was a British monetary historian named Lloyd Mintz back in the 19th century, and he looked at it. He looked at the monetary system, studying it, and this reserved Englishman says this is the work of the devil. It's that nefarious and that complex. It is a very difficult thing to wrap your hands around. Now, once you see it, then you're like, holy cow, I can't believe this. This is the problems are all right here. But to get other people up to speed, that's a challenge of a lifetime. I don't necessarily think I'm going to get through to people. That's not really my goal. My goal is we're going to crash and burn. And when it crashes and burns, my hope is that someone sifting through the rubble will find my videos and go, "Oh, this is what went wrong."
Let's not
That's
make
the
that
only thing I
mistake
can do.
again.
Yeah, let's not do that.
It's
But
sad that you've got such a, a pessimistic outlook, but I mean the reality is the reality, you know.
well,
Um,
the other thing, what reminded me of it was your Thoreau quote. Is that back in the day there were writers and politicians who understood
mm,
monetary issues. They understood them well. You know, Alexander Pope wrote about them. Thoreau. I mean, regular writers wrote. They understood what was going on, and presidents, wrote about it. Van Buren understood for sure. Andrew Jackson understood. Lincoln, even Kennedy. A lot of people understood. Now, the odds that you're going to find a politician who understands these issues is basically zero, and there aren't really any popular writers who are writing about either. It's almost I've so it makes me want to up my game because there aren't many. It's kind of a lost art almost.
yeah, and it's one of those things where it, it you can't look at the world in the same way once you understand it. Like all of these arguments from the left or the right about taxation or distribution or whatever, it's like you're talking about money that they can literally create out of thin air. They could create 100 million trillion dollars tomorrow. I mean, it's totally
Right,
me. It means a different thing to us than it means to them. We think
right.
of it as a medium of exchange. And primarily, but to them, it's a tool for social control. I think about war and armies. Like you, you would not be able to. Um, how successful would they be if they had to have a had to have volunteer armies? And even with people like people talk about oh look at the fundamentalists in the Middle East. It's like no, these people are all paid mercenaries. Like for the most part, like
Right,
they're not true
right,
believers. Take away the money and find out how many fighters you still have. Like this is all
right.
it's all a construct. And I always think about I've told the story before, but there's a documentary called The Diamond Empire that's based on a book, which I haven't read the book, but they were talking about how Cecil Rhodes, they had Rhodesia in South Africa, and they needed workers for the mines, and they were trying to get the local people to work in the mines, but they're like not interested. No thanks, we're good. So they created a government and they implemented a taxation system using money, of course, that the people don't have access to. So now they need this money, and it was a way to get the people to start working in the mines. And people don't think that there'd be a connection between those things, but there clearly is a connection. It's not an accident that the Federal Reserve was created right before World War II, or the Bank of England. There's always these banking systems are always directly connected to war. Um, what are your thoughts
Yeah,
on
for
that?
big time. Well, yeah. I mean, it was the Federal Reserve was right before World War One, and there's pretty good evidence that that was one of the principal reasons to do that. You really needed this. You needed a centralized monetary power to prosecute a war and to control an economy. And the way to control the economy is through the central bank. And it was the same thing with England. The Bank of England was started in 1694, and right away these things start to happen. You have the South Sea bubble happens right afterwards. England goes on a tear with wars because you need giant piles of debt to sustain this monetary system, increasingly huge piles of debt to sustain the monetary system. And wars are a great way to do that. Back to the political thing, it's amazing. If you look at left-right top politics just in the U.S., you'll rarely, hardly ever find anybody who doesn't support the private issuance of money. In other words, people always come back around to, yeah, we do need a debt-based monetary system, and it needs to be privately controlled. I mean, what political party stands behind? Well, No, we should have the Treasury issue the money, and there should be no debt attached to it. There's not a political party in the landscape anywhere that's for that, and that's what we need. We need a system that's not debt based, in a monetary system where you don't have private bankers who can contract the money supply overnight or expand it overnight and create inflation. So it is. You're right. It's a tremendous means of social control, because really you can create money out of thin air and you can create as much as you want. And so if you sort of localize an example, you see somebody working their whole lives to build a business. Let's say it's a poster business, something pretty simple. A Main Street business, and it grows and it gets bigger. They spend their whole lives doing this. Maybe the business gets up to be worth $10 million. Somebody comes along, somebody who's got Wall Street connections or commercial bank connections. They see that business, they can buy you out, because all they can just, they can borrow as much money as they need. $10 million is nothing to them. They can borrow $100 million, because they can create $100 million out of thin air just with some guy's promissory note, and they can go in and buy that business out, or they can install competitors there. I mean, it's a tremendous means of social control, and it is absolutely the thing that gets me probably more than anything else is it's so contrary to the rule of law. You have two choices of governance. You can either have law at the top, or you can have basically, a committee, a man at the top, like a mob boss. Those are your two choices. It's a Jeffersonian expression. It's you can be a nation of laws, or you can be a nation of men. And so if you have a nation of law, laws at the top, and nobody has any special privileges. Nobody is above the law's reach, and no one's beneath its protection. And that's the rule of law. And when you have a monetary system where there's a tiny group of people that can create money out of thin air and lend it out at interest on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's everybody else, you just set up a system of kings. And that's our system. It's a system of commercial banks. That's what makes them really the only true sovereign power in the US. Everything else is window dressing. And you're just shadow boxing with everything else.
And it's not just companies that can be taken over, but entire governments. My background was studying, going back studying the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and how money will be lent to poor nations. Often they'll be like some dictator that they'll lend a bunch of money to. The dictator will waste a bunch of it, or spend it on development, which is actually just serving the corporations that are there to extract half the time. And then the country doesn't have the money to pay to pay the loan back, and then they
Right.
can come in and say, hey, well, you know you can't pay us back, even though they know they were never going to be able to pay it back.
Right.
you, you know
That was the whole point.
you need to privatize all your everything. You need to pass these laws that we want you to pass, and it's a way to control them. And it's a setup from the very get-go. The whole thing was a setup from the
Right.
very beginning. There's
Right.
a there was a documentary, and I actually pulled a little clip out of it. I should go find it, but it was on the what happened in Greece more recently. I
Mm-hmm.
think it might be called Debtocracy, is the documentary. But there was an
I
interesting
know that.
piece in there where they were talking about when the U.S. in like 1897 or somewhere around there, the U.S. took over Cuba, and that Cuba had a whole bunch of debt, and some American academic came up with the concept of odious debt, and the idea was that this debt was not created by the people, and therefore it's not owed by the people. Of course, the people have nothing to do with it, anyways, because the U.S. just didn't
Right.
want to pay it. That was the U.S. was taking this asset, Cuba, and they didn't want to pay the debt, so they came up with this concept of odious debt, which I think should be revived actually, because
Love
I
it.
think that
I love
the debt that we owe these banks is all odious.
it. It's illegitimate.
Yeah,
To go back to your example of, sorry about that. To go back to your example of, um, lending money to countries like that. There's a whole book on that by a guy named John Perkins. The book is called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he was part of that structure. He's like, I worked for basically an NGO, and we would go down there. And the way it worked is you go down to, a country, let's say in Central America, and you really liked their resources. They had a lot of great resources, and you wanted to take them over. So how do they do that? Well, you go to some kind of, like you said, corrupt leaders, and you say, hey, if you presented a business plan, you'd have to dress up this business plan pretty well, But if you had this great business plan for what you would do with all these waterfalls in these rainforests, and you could do all these magical things and just presented this business plan, you could get a loan for $400 million. You have to promise to pay it back. And of course, the notion the whole time is we want to take over the waterfalls and the rainforests. We want to use those things ourselves. We know you're not going to be able to pay back a $400 million loan. Go ahead and sign the piece of paper. And of course, the loan is securitized, right? It's collateralized. The collateral is the resources that you're after. They sign the loan agreement in Central America, and 3 years later they can't pay the debt back. Maybe they re-up, they renegotiate a loan agreement. They maybe the lenders bargain for even more collateral, and ultimately there's a default. And when there's a default, the bankers come in and they take the collateral, and that's another way to take over the poster business. You don't even need a competitor. You just go lend the money to the poster business itself. You dangle all sorts of cash and incentives in front of them and hope they bite. And if they do, you make sure they're going to, the bank knows. The banks always, you got to remember this, the banks always know more than the lender whether the lender is going to be able to pay that money back, right? So because they not only know about you and your background, they also know about everybody in your demographic. So the banks are always, they got a good idea of whether you're going to pay that money back. And when they make the loan, what makes it so bitter to me is it's not their money. They're creating that money out of thin air, which is a sovereign privilege. That's an act that only a sovereign nation should be able to do. But we put it into the hands of private bankers. And this is what you get. You get the takeover of Central America countries. You get to take over the postage business, or my poster example business. And they just have more and more power like that. But they're getting that power. That power is leveraged from, in the U.S., from a power that is set forth in the U.S. Constitution. So,
Yeah, and I also think that like right now it's coming to a head because it appears that there's an effort to just grab everything up right now
yeah,
using the system. I mean,
right.
I know you just did a video about the Federal Reserve and how they're pumping money into basically the stock market. And there's a great video on your. I'll bring up your YouTube channel. So your YouTube channel is Best Evidence is the channel if you guys want to check it out. He's got some great, but this latest video is really good where he talks about how the Federal Reserve is basically just pumping money into the stock market. Do you want to
Well,
say a couple words about
yeah,
that? Obviously, people can go watch the
sure.
video for the longer explanation.
So there's kind of been a running debate since 2008 about when the Fed creates reserves. Okay, so what the Fed's been doing since '08 is they print money out of thin air called reserves, and they hand them the money to a bank or to a financial institution in exchange for an asset. And a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, left and right, are like screaming bloody murder about that. Like, wait, you're bailing out these banks. You're buying out assets. That's not the bank went out and bought a dead cow. That's the bank's problem. You're paying full cow prices for a dead cow. That's what's going on. So there's been a lot of screaming about that and about how you're creating so much money, the Federal Reserve is, that there's been grave concerns about, well, isn't the creation of all those, hundreds of billions of dollars and trillions of dollars, isn't that going to create inflation? And other people have said, isn't that a way just really to let the banks invest that money in the stock market, and so they can get more money. They're trading a bad debt for cash and then turning around putting the cash into the stock market. And the answer to those concerns, to the inflation concern on the one hand and to the stock market pump scheme on the other hand, has been the same by the defenders of the Federal Reserve and by the Federal Reserve itself. And the answer is no, no. The reserves, that money, the digital money, the reserves that the Fed's creating is in a different circuit than the bank money and the regular economy. So you don't need to worry about any leakage of reserves out into the economy. The things you were worried about, reserves leaking out either into higher consumer good prices or into the stock market, that actually cannot happen. And so I come along with this video, which I just released, I think last Wednesday, and say, well, actually, when you create $1 trillion in reserves, that's not the end of the story. Because when you were buying assets from a non-bank financial company, you know good and well, Federal Reserve, that that company is turning around and getting money from the commercial banks. And I can sort of walk through an explanation for why it is that you can't just create $1 trillion. The $1 trillion is just kind of a cutout in a way, and that a second $1 trillion has to be created right behind the first $1 trillion of reserves. And it's that second wave, that's that second creation of $1 trillion. That's what's getting into the stock market. And I walk through that whole thing. And that's really what that video is about. But again, it gets back to, the rule of law. And well, why is it that um, the Fed is helping out certain companies, let's say CalPERS or a pension fund or a money market mutual fund or a bank or whoever? You're helping out some people in the economy, but you're not helping out everybody. Again, it gets back to the notion of there's no rule of law. It's whoever's running the Federal Reserve, it's private banks that are picking winners and losers. And so that's why you're seeing Elon Musk and Warren Buffett, well, not Warren Buffett so much, but Bill Gates and these people, they're getting richer and richer and richer during the pandemic, while the middle class, the lower class is getting poorer and poorer and poorer. That's by design. That's what the Fed is doing.
Yeah. Um, and so a couple of people asked about here on they were talking about how the Green Party is promoting the Green New Deal, and that has a monetary aspect to it, which is be the public banking. And I know there's another thing out there called MMT, and I would like to address this because I think I actually had this idea, which I really should do. I want to make a video called "Mapping Monetary Reform" because when someone comes into this, like I did, when I got involved with monetary issues probably around 2005. I started to really study it, and it was kind of hard to navigate. Like, okay, who's who? There's different people that have different ideological foundations to their views, and also have different degrees of attachment to the system versus someone that's just like me, who's like, no, this is all bad, and we need to start with something totally new. And so
Yeah.
people are always wanting to build, and I see the pragmatism. They want to build off of what's already there. But when what's there is so rotten, I don't see that there's any building off of it. Um,
Right.
so I've been to the public. I know Alan Brown, and I've been to the two public banking conferences. And I've been following that movement for a long time. I've actually been in part of the public banking issue here in Colorado. But the problem that I have with public banking is that basically it still operates within the Federal Reserve System. It's not dealing with the beast.
Right.
It's not
Right.
really taking back the power. It's basically just saying that we want to have, we want cities and states to have access to the discount window, which actually would do some good. It would bring some money in to
It would
help
be
make
an
some,
improvement.
right. It would be an improvement, but you're still giving all the keys to your enemy,
Right.
essentially. I mean, the people that are
Right.
running the show are like, I I hate I don't know what other word to use than evil. Even though I'm not a
Right.
religious person, and I know that's kind of a like what that word means, but it's really diabolical what they do, and it's anti-life, it's anti-human, and
Right.
I
It
don't
is
believe that.
anti-human.
Yeah, and I don't believe that we need to let them have any power at all. Like people should have the power to create money, and we should like totally. I believe it. I think public banking could be a good thing if it were designed right, but it can't be under the Federal Reserve System. It cannot have interest, and there's a lot of debate within the
Right.
community about this. But when you create interest money with interest as a debt, you've already set yourself up for failure. And they claim, well, we're going to spend some of this money back on public services, and that might happen, and that's good, but it's also taking away from other people that are getting that money. It's creating an imbalance right from the get-go. And also, like, I don't trust
Yes.
politicians to do the right thing. So whatever system we set up, I want to set up with a a fail safe, some sort of, there's no way that they can actually screw you sort of setup, you know. And then the other thing is MMT. And then the other thing is the gold standard. There's a lot of people that think, oh, if we could just go back to the gold standard, and I'm like, well, we kind of had a Great
Right.
Depression under the gold standard. I don't know how that all
Right.
worked. So do you want to just maybe say a few words a little bit about like
Yeah.
some of the different camps within the monetary reform movement? Like me, I'm very concerned about ecological environmental issues, and a lot of the libertarian approachers and the Mises and the Austrian school don't seem to have that built into their design solutions. But at the end of the day, I want people to start learning about this, and like even if we disagree, we can have a conversation and say, well, I don't know about that, but what about this? Like actually have that conversation. But do you want to kind of share your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I'll just sort of walk through. There's a lot to unpack there, but let me just kind of sort of go through it one by one. This sort of new green movement. Right off the bat, I will tell you, I looked enough into that to see the name Mark Carney prominently featured. Mark Carney is a former governor of the Bank of England. He's actually the former governor of the Bank of Canada, I believe. And he was also at one time until 2018, I think, he was the head of the Financial Stability Board in the Bank for International Settlements. Mark Carney is a Goldman Sachs former executive, and wherever you see his name, it's just bad news. I did a documentary on my channel called "All the Plenary's Men." I have a section in there that of Carney testifying before Parliament, and it takes me a while to unpack it because he's a professional liar. But wherever you see Mark Carney, you're going to get lies, you're going to get obfuscation, and you're going to get things twisted around. And Goldman Sachs and the gang is going to end up richer, and you're going to end up poorer. So I'll just say that when I see Carney's name, I know that there's big trouble. Also on your channel, I've seen you had Corey Morningstar, and she has done some phenomenally good work, investigative work into this sort of corporate green movement. It's sort of the corporate green movement is really designed to put a smiley face on to an iron fist that's going to punch through your face and it's going to rip you off and it's going to destroy things and it's going to destroy the environment. But if they can co-opt it and then get people in there to get behind them, that's ideally what they're going to do. And Corey Morningstar has done some really good work on exposing that. Let's go to MMT, modern monetary theory. MMT is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It sounds good. Again, it's a smiley face on the iron fist. MMT's job is to get you to come back around. And ultimately, MMT is going to come out and say, you know what? Everything's fine. It's fine having private bankers issue debt based money. There's really no way around that. It's just the best system there is. It may not be perfect, but it's the best thing we got. And that's my read on MMT. Sort of like, debt jubilee. It's like, well, why would, yeah, debt jubilee is nice and that's a good idea and all, but you really shouldn't need a jubilee at all if you had a real monetary system. MMT, one of their central teaching is debt is money and money is debt, and it always has been that way. And it's like, no, money is not debt and debt is not money. They are not the same. They are different. We use money to pay off debts. Money, a big difference between money and debt based money is that banks love debt based money because they can contract the money supply. When they expand the money supply, money doesn't die. Real money doesn't die like that. You can't just shrink it overnight. You can't just shrink the money supply 30% like they did in the Great Depression. So I would be very careful of MMT, just for the teaching that debt is money and money is debt. That's a bunch of nonsense. Legally, that's wrong as a matter of law. Money is not debt, and debt is not money, and that's just the end of the story. So you've broken your ankles in the starting gate with that notion. The Austrians and the gold movement, like you say, gold has really led to the depression. And the problem, it sounds good because it's like it's honest money. You can't print gold. There's only so much gold, and so there's a superficial appeal to it.
Well, and we don't even
But
know how
almost
much gold there is in the world, actually.
that's one problem. Another problem is that almost immediately. Let's say I'm the goldsmith, right? eventually what happens is people come into the bank almost instantaneously and they're going to be like, well, I don't want to carry around the gold. I'd rather carry around pieces of paper. I'd rather carry around the claims because they're easier. As long as I know I can redeem my claim check, sort of like I can redeem it at the restaurant to get my coat back, everything's going to be cool. And immediately what happens is the goldsmith, whoever's holding the gold, issues more claims than there is gold. And that means they're issuing money. And so almost instantaneously, you're back to a debt-based monetary system because the gold issuer who's going to issue those claims, he's not going to issue them for free. He's going to charge interest. So you're back to square one. And in fact, one of the reasons that the gold-based system we had until 1934 in the U.S., it was in place when we had a depression. One of the things the bankers love about a gold-based system is if gold is functioning as your reserves, then you can control the amount of money in society simply in the U.S. simply by shipping gold overseas and selling it to foreign owners. And then your reserve base shrinks because the gold's now out of the country. And because your reserve base shrinks, now you've got to shrink bank money. And so that's really not an answer either. So what you ultimately need is a system where real money is issued by the U.S. government. And I hear what you're saying. You want a fail safe from politicians. There's no perfect system. And I'm here to tell you that a choice between corrupt politicians operating within the U.S. government or corrupt bankers operating in secrecy and not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests, that's an easy choice. I'll take the one that has to answer a FOIA request any old day of the week. So that's
Yeah,
sort of my 2 minute around the world
yeah.
summary of the various monetary movements. You
But I
got
don't
to
even think we
think
have to be
through.
stuck in those two choices either. I mean, I think that we could come up with
Yeah, right.
solutions. I mean, human beings are smart if we can put our mind. We can we can do a lot of really brilliant things, if we put our mind to it. And I think we can solve this problem as well. Really understanding all the dynamics of it and all the challenges to it. You know.
Yeah, and there are a lot of thoughtful people have put out a lot of good proposals on how to do exactly what you're saying, which is, you set up commissions, independent commissions through the government, but they have government oversight. But you've seen what happens with the Federal Reserve. The whole Federal Reserve system, is it public? Is it private? It's this whole shuck and jive that leaves the creation of money into private hands. But it's got this public face gloss like, well, the Federal Reserve chairman is appointed by the president and he's got
Yeah.
to be confirmed by the Senate. It's like, yeah, but he's not sitting on the top of any
And the
any bank
president
that's
can't
issuing
just
money.
appoint anybody. From what I understand,
Right.
the president can only appoint someone from within their pool of people. So it's kind of like a fraud to begin with,
Yeah.
anyways. Even that token thing. And I also know, like, when I can't remember which. I think it was some senator was asking about what they did with the bailout money, and they said, "Well, that's proprietary information. We don't have to
Yeah.
tell you." Uh, which we know kind of what they
Well,
did. We know to some
and
extent
you
what they
remember
did.
what happened there? It was really there ended up being an audit through all of that because the Federal Reserve was running all these programs, and it was a case of the left and right kind of coming together and doing good for once, which was Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul, and they got together and said, we really need to audit this. But it was also a journalist named Mark Pittman of Bloomberg who
Hmm.
had submitted FOIA requests to the New York Fed saying, "What's going on with these with your all these programs you've got running? Who's getting this money?" And the New York Fed wouldn't answer, and the Fed wouldn't answer, and Pittman took these guys to court, and he won his FOIA suit. So it was really politician on the left and a libertarian politician and a guy from the fourth estate. I mean, that's what it took to get an audit just to figure out who got money from the commercial paper funding facility, which was the Federal Reserve, one of their many, many bailout programs, because
Yeah.
the Fed wouldn't tell anybody. And when it came out, they were trying to sell that program. It's like, oh, well, we need commercial paper because commercial paper is going to prop up Main Street, right? That was their big sell. That was their big pitch for TARP is like commercial paper is the linkage between Main Street and Wall Street. And then when the audit finally comes out, I think it was in 2011, the results of that audit were released. Who got the commercial paper money from the Fed. Was it Main Street? Nah, it was foreign banks. It was foreign financial institutions. It was American financial institutions like AIG, foreign banks like Dexia, and American companies like, Ford Motor Credit and GMAC. I mean, it was everybody but Main Street got money from the commercial paper funding facility, and it wasn't a small facility either. That was $800 billion. It was actually bigger than TARP, and that's why they didn't want to tell you who got the money because it was foreigners. Most of the money went overseas.
Hmm.
It's like, well, do you think that would happen if the Treasury is issuing money? Absolutely no way.
And real quick, I just wanted to say someone on the YouTube says was brought up the point that the Green Party doesn't support MMT. I just wanted to clarify. I was just saying there's different camps. The Green Party supports
Yeah,
public banking, which is also
good.
problematic. It does a lot, but it also doesn't go far enough, and that's really kind of the
Right.
point that I was making. Of all the different things out there, I actually like public banking. There's a reason why I've actually been involved with helping make videos and support it. It would do some things to help us, but I think we don't really have time to mess around anymore. I think we really need to just truly solve this problem, not just put a band-aid on it. And the Public Banking Institute is really putting a band-aid on it, and it's you know. So I wanted to say that these are the different camps out there. I wanted to kind of address that. But can you stick around for just a little bit longer? I know we've been going for about an hour here. I wanted to
Yeah,
go through because the reason why I wanted to bring up a lot of my channel has been focused on the World Economic Forum and the work, what they're doing, and which is
yeah,
which is huge. I mean, they've got this whole fourth industrial revolution that they've, great reset that they're proposing. But the piece of it that I want to bring in more, and which is why I wanted to have you on here, was there's which I actually think is even bigger, in terms of hierarchy, the hierarchical structure. It really, the foundations in these corporations are not as high as the banks in terms of actual
right.
power is concerned, and so a lot of the focus has been on the work that World Economic Forum is doing. But I also want to pull
Yeah,
in to this piece of the puzzle. What the Bank of International Settlements is up to, and the Bank of England, and these
right,
financial institutions, because they're really the ones that create the fuel that drives the whole thing. Like, none of this happens without financing. And so
right.
I gotten a couple clips from you of Karsten. What's his name?
Augustin Carson is the GM, general manager of the Bank for International Settlements. And just so people know, the U.S. central bank is the Federal Reserve, and you have other central banks. The Bank of Japan is the central bank in Japan. The European Central Bank, Bank of England. There's all these central banks. The head of them all, or at the top, is the Bank for International Settlements. That's the central bank of central banks. And Augustin Carstens is the head guy at the BIS.
So I thought we go. I'll show a clip, and then we'll have you talk a little bit about it, and then I'll show. I have three clips. Do
Yeah,
you want to do that real quick?
yeah. That's good. Let's go through those.
Okay.
First of all, CBDC will always be a national decision. It's a sovereign decision. It will be the third type of liability of a central bank, and therefore it will respond primarily to domestic circumstances.
So I don't know
Okay.
if people can follow that. It's a little bit like, you want to just kind of just
Yeah. I'll
say
just
what
sort of
what.
set.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sort of set the table here. That's Augustin Carson's playing good cop there. He's going to be bad cop in a minute. That's good cop. What he said is factually correct. He wants to say it's a sovereign decision because he wants everybody to know. Well, the U.S. can decide whether or not it wants to have a central bank digital currency, and England can make its own decision, and so on and so forth. And when he says it's the third type of liability, that too is accurate. At the outset, I was saying, at the Federal Reserve issues cash. That's one type of liability. Federal Reserve notes, paper. And the second type of liability it issues is reserves. When Carson says it's a third type of liability, what he means is that everybody, let's say in the US, for example, would have a digital wallet, and the money supplier of that wallet would be the Federal Reserve. And so there's 330 million of us. Let's say every wallet has $1,000 in it, so that's $330 billion. That would be the liability to the Fed, $330 billion in our example, and the asset would be it would be a $330 billion bond. And that's what he means when he says it's the third type of liability. He doesn't walk through it that much, but that's easy. That's sort of like just the ABCs of central bank digital currency. That's all he's saying there. But there's two other clips that you should pay very close attention to these next two clips.
Now, in all our analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash. And there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that.
Okay, now the gloves are coming off. Okay, so you heard what he just said. The problem with the $100 bill is we don't know who's got the $100 bill, and we don't know what they're spending it on. So the great thing about central bank digital currencies is we'll know exactly where it is. We'll know exactly what it's being used on, and we'll have rules over what you can spend your money on, and we'll have the technology to enforce it. And Carson's is excited about this. He's like, this is a good thing. It's like, this sounds like a nightmare to me. But there's another clip that he goes on a little bit more.
Therefore, I think this lends itself to design carefully CBDC in such a way that they will not be a vehicle for fragmentation, for financial instability, and for spillovers. Therefore, I don't think that by themselves CBDC is a threat to the international monetary system. For example, in the issue of currency substitution, if an advanced economy issues a CBDC and somebody in a third country wants to use it, it will require the consent of the central bank of the residence of that person. Therefore, the degree of control will be far bigger. Now, this I think it's good news, because I think that it really provides the ground for us to think on how can we use CBDC to really obtain these higher objectives of facilitating payments internationally. How are we going to make them to reduce costs, to enhance inclusion? How are we going to make this route run smoothly?
There you go. What he's saying there, sort of roundabout way, he says we can. In the previous clip, he said, well, we have the technology to enforce the rules about how this can be used, how your money can be used, how you are allowed to use your money. And there he gives you a little bit of an idea of what he's talking about. He's saying we can decide whether the transaction is going to go through basically based on higher objectives. And it's like, well, that's like inclusion was the example he used. So it's like, well, that sounds like you're just going to make up goals on the fly and decide willy-nilly, what we can use money on and what we can't use money on, right? There's no standard. The standard is whatever we say it is right now, right? So if you think back to the pandemic, early on, sort of in the pandemic, you had Fauci comes on 60 Minutes and says, nobody should be wearing masks, nothing to worry about. And within a few weeks, he's like, everybody should be wearing masks. So it's like, well, it's A one day and it's not A, it's the negation of A the next day. Just imagine that now with money. One day you can spend money on flowers and the next day you can't because of reasons X, Y, and Z. It's a system of total monetary control by private bankers. That's what he just said there.
Yeah, and so why should it matter? No, it's pretty insane. Like what they're proposing, and it's such a radical shift in power. And I always look at like how power is distributed. Um, what do you think people can do about this?
I would. You can certainly write your congressman and say, we're opposed to central bank digital currency. Um, but you need to watch these guys. They're rolling ahead with this no matter what. Now, that said, Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, he knows that there are some issues with central bank digital currency in the U.S. And you could see that from that conference. What the clips we just watched were from October of this year, 2 months ago, and there was sort of a roundtable discussion, and Jerome Powell was part of that discussion. It was hosted by the IMF, and it had there was cross border payments was in the title. You can find it pretty quickly. But Powell, the things Powell was saying reflected the fact that he understands it's a major legal leap forward or backward. It's a major legal change for the U.S. to implement a central bank digital currency. So what I'm saying in a roundabout way is this battle is not yet. It's early on, and its outcome is not foreordained. So this is something. If you want to raise hell about an issue, this would be a good one to raise hell at, because it's going to end up with you're going to have no say over your own money. And at first you're going to have no say at the national level. And then it's going to get worse, because ultimately it's going to go to a single reserve currency issued probably by the Bank for International Settlements, and they will call all the shots. And you'll have no representation through Congress at all. We'll be back to pre 1776, just like that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, John. And I want to make a clarification. I noticed a comment on the YouTube. Sue had mentioned that she's with the American Monetary Institute and also the
Yeah,
Alliance,
I love that.
yeah, Alliance for Just Money. And I've done a lot of work with them, and they're really great people. And I think
Big
they're
fans too. Really like AMI.
yeah, AMI. Let's see here. I've got here's their website. Monetary.org is their website. And also I highly recommend reading the book by Steven Zarlenga, The Lost Science of Money. Really great
Yeah,
book.
let me tell you a story real quick.
Yeah.
I started doing this when I got into monetary issues. I had a guy reach out to me on the channel, and he knows this guy works in like the plumbing of the monetary system. And I go to him and I say, well, how's this work, or how's that? Well, this guy knows the score. And we were talking one night on a Zoom call or whatever, and I said, so what do you read? What's like the ultimate authority? He said this, and he holds up The Lost Science of Money by Zarlenga is the Bible.
Yeah, it's a pretty intensive book. I mean, it's not a light read, but you can
No,
learn. Yeah, you'll
no.
get an education with that. And then the other group, there's another group that branched off from them called the Alliance for Just Money. That their website is, I think, monetaryalliance.org. Let me see here.
Yeah,
Yeah, monetaryalliance.org is their website. So I highly recommend you guys checking them out. And earlier I was talking about the Green Party supporting um,
yeah, MMT. And they said they
MMT.
didn't.
Yeah, so they were saying that actually they don't, but they don't.
Good to know.
But they also, I guess they are now, and I didn't realize this, that they now endorse the American Monetary Institute's AMI.
Yeah, I try to tell people, it's MMT. There's a lot of stuff that's right about MMT. I don't mean to bash them, but I mean, like, there's stuff on double entry accounting, and that's all right. But they tend to trip up on the most important stuff, like what's sovereignty mean, you know, or what's agency? Is the Federal Reserve really the agent of the Treasury? It doesn't look that way to me. Or debt is money. So it's like on the big issues they're getting the stuff wrong, but on the small stuff they're dead on. But I think AMI, they really nail it, to my
Yeah,
way of thinking, my opinion.
yeah, definitely. Well, and then I'll just put this back up one more time. If you can follow John's work on YouTube. Best Evidence is the name of his channel. And John, do you have any other websites or anything, or other ways people can reach you, or is it mainly just the YouTube
No,
channel that you're
that's
doing?
it for now.
Okay.
I'm
Well,
I'm still learning how to make videos. I'm not good.
well, I'm really grateful for you and your work, and I would love to do this again if you'd be down. That we can maybe field more. I didn't really take too many questions because this is our first show. We're doing a little over an hour here,
Okay.
but um,
Yeah.
but
Why don't we circle back maybe in a month or whatever? Some
yeah,
more stuff will
definitely.
happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you think? I think
Yeah,
a lot
a lot of changes coming.
I
By
get
the
it.
way, back to something you had alluded to earlier, the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and all these guys. Just my nutshell opinion on that
Mhm.
is that in a lot of ways, Klaus Schwab is so buffoonish that he's almost a cartoon character,
He's a James
and
Bond
thus,
villain.
yeah, he's like a Bond villain. And then it's like, well, are you serious? I mean, it's like you're waving a red flag at a bull. You want me to jump all over him? I can only assume that you are attempting to distract me from something else. And indeed, I think that's what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I do think that they are implementing programs. I mean, if you look at the alignment of, I mean, Klaus Schwab, the character, I think a lot of these people that are just figureheads, Mark Zuckerberg or Klaus Schwab or whatever, they're really figureheads. They're the public face
Right.
of something that's going on behind the scenes. And yeah, you're right. We end up focusing on the public face and not enough on the gears that are operating the machinery. I saw that with Trump too. Like people need to have some sort of thing that they can channel all their energy into. Um, it's really effective. It's really powerful.
Uh,
But
it is very effective. Holy cow.
yeah, but I mean, like digging into like, okay, what are the actual policies that are being pushed forward? What are the actual changes that are taking place? And I think that we need a little bit more of that, and that's what you're doing, and some of the others that I've been interviewing. So I really grateful for you, and thank you all for joining us. And we will see you next time. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Jason. My wheelhouse is less monetary and more legal,
Mm,
right? So that's really what the thing where I really started to get noticed on YouTube is I made a video called "The Veneer of Justice in the Kingdom of Crime," which picked up where the Frontline episode by Martin Smith left off, the non-prosecution of Wall Street, and that had a huge write-up, very favorable in Zero Hedge, and that video got over 100,000 views, and that's when people were like, "Holy shit, what's this guy?" Because I really lay into the DOJ and really the press
mm,
pretty good in that one. But then because I was, that's where I know that material really well, so I don't have a problem taking out a Louisville Slugger and just letting people have it.
yeah,
Whereas monetary stuff, I'm not. I got to call my guy and be like, "Hey, is this how the plumber?" I got to call the plumber and say, "Is this how this works?" You
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
Well, and it's
so
been
foreclosure,
made. It's been made
I'll tell you.
really complicated intentionally. It's not. It's not.
Yes, yes,
It's
right,
it's like by
right,
design to keep you not understanding it. I was actually interested in this issue back when I was in high school. I was listening to. I realized even back then, oh, it's the monetary system, but I wanted to learn about it. And I went and bought a book by William Greider called Secrets of the Temple. I don't know if you're
yeah,
familiar with this book. He's like your typical leftist, but he's like he doesn't actually talk about the money system. He's talking about like
yeah,
the management of it, like raising and lowering interest rates, and like he's
yeah.
talking about
I
the
know,
management of
right?
it. He's not actually talking about the nature of it, not the nature, but
Right.
the
The
essence of it.
fundamental, the real fundamental, the issues of justice.
Yeah, or
Yeah, they
like
both.
reading I'm like going out trying to find any book I can about the money and monetary systems, and there's a couple of them. There's one by Jack Weatherford, I think, and then there's another one by Neil Ferguson, not
Yeah,
Nail Niall,
yeah,
and I'm like, the
yeah,
book, it's about numismatics, it's about coinage, it's not about
yeah.
money.
Right,
And the book's
right.
called The History of Money, There's a couple
Yeah,
of them, and so I'm like, you're reading
yeah.
this book and you're left with absolutely nothing. You're left with
There's
like
a total
no
waste of time.
total
It's,
waste of time, and I'm like, what the
yeah,
fuck is this? And, it's a joke.
right.
So
It's insane. It's like if the book gets promoted, just don't even waste your time on it.
right,
The
yeah,
best
yeah.
books I found you never heard of. I found one by a woman from 1935 called The Money
Really?
Creators
Oh
with a
wow, really?
co-author. The co-author is a guy named Robert Owen, who was the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee for like over a
I'm
decade, and he was a
Owen.
co-author.
Was he the guy? Yeah, he was the one. He was the Scottish guy that was like he was promoting. I've heard of Owen. He
Robert
was.
Owen. He's a senator
Oh, okay,
from
never
the
mind.
mid. From Heartland. Anyway, these
You,
books. I found these great books, but nobody. I'd never heard of them, and they were
yeah.
fantastic
How did you
books.
find that?
I kept reading I kept finding weird books and reading footnotes and reading books and reading
And you
footnotes
have
and
send me a name of that book. I would love to get. I'm
yeah,
always looking for that kind of anything like.
I'll send you a couple. They're just like,
Yeah.
holy shit, how did I miss this one? And
Another thing
half
I'm
of them are, you know,
another thing I'm trying to learn about is colonial script. Because I'd read a
yeah,
quote supposedly attributed to Ben Franklin about that the Revolutionary War
right,
was primarily about the loss of their right to create
right,
script. And so
right.
I was at an antique bookstore here in Denver, and there was a book on the American Revolution, and I flipped up and I saw, oh shit, there's a whole chapter on colonial script, and this book
Yeah.
came out in the 50s, and I flipped to that chapter, and it's fucking missing. Like it's missing.
No.
The book was printed without the chapter. Like, and I and I went to the guy that ran the bookstore. I was like,
No way.
is this normal? It's not that it was ripped out. Like it was, you can tell
Right.
it was actually
I
printed
get
that
it.
way, and it was
Yeah.
missing not just that chapter, a little bit of the before and a little bit after, but it was missing the parts that I was looking for, and I'm like, that's really weird. Like, what are the odds of that? Like, and so I want to find that book again. Actually, I have it written down. I want to find another copy of it and find out if that's the same, and if the
That's
same
crazy.
situation. But it was a book about the American Revolution that had a chapter on colonial script that was
Yeah.
missing.
That was Ben Franklin said that. And then Alexander Del Mar picked that up and he said, that's what the revolution was about. He said
Yeah,
Lexington and Concord were just skirmishes, the
right.
real deal money supply.
Yeah,
Yeah. But
and
that
then
the original Franklin that was from his autobiography. The best books I found, I mean, there's Zarlenga, but that's a long read.
yeah.
But aside from him, the best books I found, you've never heard of them. You know, I mean, one was written as a high school textbook in
Mm.
1940
Oh
by a
wow.
woman named by a woman named Etta Russell, called something like the Constitutional Principles of Money. It's short and it's just like, holy shit, this thing is really good. You don't
Wow.
even have to read the whole thing to get it. Like, wow, this is dynamite.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, it was reading and chasing and just going to bookfinder.com and you know these books. The good books are hard to find. You know,
Yeah, for sure. Whenever I'm in a bookstore, a used bookstore, I'm always looking like for anything on money, and I've got a good little collection too. But nothing that I've got the handful, but it's those old gems. Those are the ones
yeah,
I'm always. So
yeah,
I would love to have the names of those. See if I can't track them down myself, because
yeah. I'll send you a list of like my best 3 or 4 off.
well, and even reading
Got them.
Zarlenga's opening to his book, he's like, yeah, they've been erasing this history, and like that's what.
Yeah, he's totally right about that. Yeah, that's in
Yeah.
large part, I think, what Google is up to.
Oh yeah, and they can do it in real time.
Yeah, erasing history is a big deal. So I'll get
The
your books
article's
now.
changing as you're reading it.
Yeah, you got it. You got that right.